When Eilat Mazar realized she discovered an ancient structure near Jerusalem, she turned to the Bible to help explain what she found.
And she learned that this new discovery supports the biblical accounts of King David and his son Solomon.
In the final years of her life, Eilat Mazar made a confession that sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. She claimed to have found it, the lost palace of King David. This wasn't just any discovery, it was the potential validation of the biblical narrative itself.
We have this biblical story that tells about King Solomon doing the same thing. So he did, and then like 50 years later, some other king did the same thing. So I think we can drop all these, fighting against the Bible.
Critics had dismissed David as a mere tribal chieftain, his kingdom a fantasy. But the sheer scale of what Mazar found beneath Jerusalem suggested something else entirely. We'll explore the controversial evidence she revealed, a final word that challenges everything we thought we knew. The woman who dug too deep. Born into a dynasty of archaeologists, Dr. Eilat Mazar was practically destined to dig in the dirt. You see, her grandfather, Benjamin Mazar, was a giant in the field, one of the pioneers who helped shape modern Israeli archaeology. Eilat grew up hearing stories of his incredible discoveries, and it was no surprise when she picked up a shovel herself. But the thing nobody tells you is that Eilat wasn't just another academic. She was different. While her peers saw the Bible as a collection of inspiring but historically questionable tales, Eilat saw it as a roadmap. She had a deep spiritual conviction that the stories weren't just fables, they were a guide to a world long gone. This belief, to put it mildly, set her apart. In some academic circles, calling someone a biblical archaeologist was not a compliment. It was almost an insult, suggesting their work was based on faith, not facts. Many argued it was better to focus on hard evidence, pottery, ancient texts, and ruins without the filter of Scripture. But Mazar disagreed. For her, the Bible and the artifacts were two halves of the same puzzle. What many overlooked was that she saw the Bible as a genuine historical document, one that could point her to where the most monumental discoveries might be hiding. Her life's work became a laser-focused mission to find physical proof for the grand narratives of the Bible. And at the top of her list was the legendary King David. She wasn't just looking for random artifacts from the ancient kingdom of Israel, she wanted to find the very seat of David's power, his palace. She was convinced the key wasn't in some remote desert cave, but right under everyone's noses, in the oldest part of Jerusalem, the city of David. For thousands of years, this small, dusty hill has been a city of stone, faith, and mystery. It is the original core of Jerusalem, inhabited for millennia before the Romans or Crusaders ever set foot there. This was once a Jebusite fortress, considered so impenetrable that its defenders mocked the advancing Israelites, boasting that even the lame and the blind could hold the walls. They seriously underestimated David. The biblical account says the warrior king found a secret way in through a water shaft, conquered the fortress, and turned it into the capital of his new, powerful kingdom. It became the city where prophets walked and kings ruled. Yet for all its fame, one thing was missing: the palace. Despite centuries of digging, from 19th century explorers tunneling deep beneath the hill to modern archaeologists, David's royal residence remained a ghost, a story in a book. The consensus was that the palace either never existed on a grand scale or was lost to time forever. But Eilat Mazar was certain they were all looking in the wrong place. Her entire theory, her entire career, rested on a single, overlooked verse from the Bible. She was about to gamble everything on a clue that her colleagues had dismissed as pure fantasy, a dangerous hypothesis. For Eilat Mazar, the answer had been hiding in plain sight for 3,000 years. The clue that would define her life's work came from the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 5, verse 11. It reads, "And Hiram king of Tyre sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons, and they built David a house." Now, to most, this is just a simple line in a long story. But to Mazar, every word was a critical piece of data. The mention of Hiram, the king of the mighty Phoenician city of Tyre, was the first bombshell. This meant the architect of David's palace wasn't some local builder. You see, a king of Hiram's stature would only engage in such a massive project with a monarch of equal power and influence. This single detail suggested that David's kingdom wasn't some backwater village. It was a regional powerhouse respected by its neighbors. This led Mazar to a revolutionary idea, what became known as the Mazar hypothesis. She reasoned that a palace built by the world's best craftsmen, using expensive imported materials like the legendary cedars of Lebanon, would have been an awe-inspiring symbol of power. It wouldn't have been tucked away in a valley. It would have been built on the highest, most visible, and most defensible spot on the hill. Her eyes turned to a specific area called the Ophel, an elevated ridge connecting the city of David to the Temple Mount. At the very top of this ridge sat a massive, enigmatic structure that had puzzled archaeologists for decades, the step-stone structure. It was a colossal series of man-made terraces like giant stone stairs carved into the hillside. Mazar became convinced this was the biblical Millo, a defensive earthwork mentioned multiple times in the Bible as being fortified by both David and his son Solomon. Her theory was as simple as it was bold. David's grand palace, a gift from a foreign king, would have been built directly on top of this massive pre-existing fortress. It was an extreme idea because the academic establishment had largely decided that the stories of a grand unified monarchy under David and Solomon were nationalist myths, written centuries later to inspire hope. They argued there was simply no archaeological evidence for a major kingdom in the 10th century BCE. For them, Mazar's reliance on the Bible was, to put it mildly, wishful thinking. They felt digging up a spot based on a single verse was a colossal waste of time and money. But Mazar was relentless. In 2005, she finally secured the funding and permission to dig. The world was watching and many were waiting for her to fail. She was about to dig into the heart of a legend, and what she found was more than just stone. Palace rises from dust. During the blistering summer of 2005, as temperatures in Jerusalem soared, Eilat Mazar and her team began to dig. The heat was the least of their worries. They were excavating at the very spot her hypothesis pointed to, just north of the city of David, right above the massive stepstone structure. Other archaeologists had looked at this spot and moved on, but for Mazar, it was the front door to history. Carefully, they started clearing away layers of dirt and debris, peeling back the centuries one bucket at a time. It wasn't long before they hit something promising. Thick walls made of enormous, sturdy stones began to emerge from the earth. These weren't the humble rocks of a simple house. They were the foundations of something truly significant. As they dug deeper, the scale of the find became breathtaking. They weren't just uncovering a building, they were uncovering a citadel. The walls were up to 6 feet thick in some places, built from stones so large they would have required immense manpower and engineering skill to move. Piece by piece, a massive complex began to take shape, far larger than anything else ever found from that period in Jerusalem. It became known as the large stone structure. The sheer size of it was a wow factor in itself. This wasn't a chieftain's hut. It had the architectural footprint of a major public building, a royal residence. Some of the stones weighed several tons and were finely cut, a level of craftsmanship that screamed wealth and centralized power. But the most important question remained: how old was it? To answer that, Mazar's team relied on pottery, the archaeologist's clock. You see, pottery styles change over time, and experts can date fragments with remarkable accuracy. Within the foundations of the large stone structure sealed beneath the massive stones, they found a treasure trove of pottery fragments. The styles were overwhelmingly from the 10th century BCE, the very time the Bible says King David ruled. The location was right, the scale was right, and now the date was right. It was a perfect match for her theory. This single discovery challenged the long-held view that 10th century Jerusalem was just a sleepy little town. A building this grand meant Jerusalem was the capital of a real, organized kingdom. The discovery was compelling, but to truly silence the critics, Mazar needed more than stones and pottery. She needed a name. She needed to find a direct link from the stones to the people who once walked these halls. The Bulla bombshell. The massive stones of the palace were impressive, no doubt. Their sheer size and careful placement made it clear that this was no ordinary building. But impressive walls alone weren't enough to convince skeptics. After all, a large, well-constructed structure could have had many purposes over the centuries: administrative, military, or ceremonial. What Eilat Mazar needed was something more personal, something that could directly connect this grand edifice to the royal court described in the Bible. She needed evidence that spoke not just to the scale of the structure, but to the people who had walked its halls. And then, after months of meticulous excavation just outside the palace wall, her team uncovered it. A tiny piece of baked clay no larger than a thumbnail. It was a bulla, a clay seal used in ancient times to stamp and authenticate official documents. Think of it like the ancient equivalent of a wax seal on a royal decree, a symbol of authority, identity, and legitimacy. As they carefully brushed the dirt away, the inscription on the bulla slowly revealed itself. It read, "Belonging to Jehucal, son of Shealmiah, son of Shavi." At first glance, it was just a name, but for anyone familiar with biblical texts, it was extraordinary. Jehucal is mentioned explicitly in the book of Jeremiah as a high-ranking minister in the court of King Zedekiah, one of the last kings of Judah. Suddenly, the massive stones of the palace were no longer anonymous. They were tied to real, named figures from history. The discovery alone would have been remarkable, but the story didn't end there. A few years later, the excavation yielded a second bulla just meters away. This one bore the inscription, "Gedaliah, son of Pasheor." Again, the connection to the Bible was immediate and undeniable. Gedaliah appears in the same passage in Jeremiah as an accomplice of Jehucal in a plot to silence the prophet. Two seals, linked to two officials, both mentioned in the same verse, discovered in the same archaeological layer. It was statistically staggering. The likelihood of such a coincidence occurring by chance was astronomically low. Here in the dirt of Jerusalem, the Bible's pages and the archaeological record were speaking to each other directly. But perhaps the most sensational find was yet to come. In 2015, Mazar revealed the discovery of another bulla, this one inscribed, "Belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah." King Hezekiah, one of Judah's most celebrated monarchs and a direct descendant of David, suddenly had his personal seal unearthed in the very city his ancestors had ruled. Finding the personal seal of a biblical king is akin to discovering a signed photograph of a historical figure. It's intimate, direct, and unmistakable proof of presence. For Mazar, this was the moment that brought her decades of research into full focus. While the bullae were from a period centuries after David himself, their proximity to the large stone structure was crucial. It demonstrated that the site had been used as a royal administrative center for generations, maintaining its status as the heart of governance in Jerusalem. A king like Hezekiah would have naturally placed his administration in the historic royal quarter in the palace originally built by his forefather. The stone walls that had once seemed silent now had voices carried by the names etched in clay. The bullae did something even more remarkable. They gave the palace a human dimension. These weren't just rulers recorded in annals, they were people who lived, planned, and worked within these walls. Jehucal and Gedaliah weren't abstract characters from a sacred text. They were men who had interacted with prophets, plotted schemes, and shaped the political life of Jerusalem. Hezekiah wasn't just a legendary king, he had a tangible presence, authenticated by his seal, linking him directly to the very stones under Mazar's trowel. For critics who doubted the historicity of the biblical narrative, these tiny clay seals were irrefutable. They provided the names and faces that brought the stone walls to life. The Bible, it seemed, was not merely a book of stories or moral lessons, it was a record of real people in real places making real decisions. The palace, long suspected to be the royal seat described in ancient texts, was now inseparably tied to the figures who once walked its corridors. And so, from a tiny piece of clay no bigger than a fingernail, a story emerged that reshaped our understanding of Jerusalem's ancient past. The walls of the palace, the largest stones in the city, were no longer just impressive architecture, they were witnesses to history. They had seen the footsteps of kings, ministers, and prophets. They had stood silent through centuries of conquest, exile, and return. Did Eilat Mazar really find King David's palace, or was it the greatest case of confirmation bias in history? Let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.